Okay, dear friends, the topic is the Torah universal or particular? Or was it given just for the Jewish people, or maybe for a few others, or for everyone? Um, I'll start off with this story. I took a taxi in Toronto, and for some reason, the taxi driver liked to talk. And he was a fellow from Somalia, which I think they're all Muslims there. So I mentioned I was from Israel, whatever. So, and I forget, we were talking about something, and then I said to him, I believe in the Bible. He said to me, you don't believe in the Bible, you believe in the Torah. I said, okay, you're right, I believe in the Torah. So he says to me, in our tradition, there are 4 holy books. It says in the Quran, there are 4 holy books. There's the Quran, there is the Torah, there is the book of Dawud, which is the Psalms, and then there's the Injil, which means the New Testament. I said, okay. It's actually interesting because in the Yalkut Shimoni, there's a midrash that says that there are 2 books that have 5 books in them. One is the Torah, which has, of course, the 5 Chumashim, and one is Tehillim, which is also broken up into 5 books. And many people read the Tehillim based on the 5-book breakdown. So, obviously, this fellow also believed in our Torah. So the question is then, what exactly is the difference between the way a Jew believes in the Torah, or a Muslim, or a Christian? Is the Torah just for us? Does it have a universal aspect to it? And if so, why isn't everybody studying the Torah? Well, it says the Midrash has a very ambivalent relationship to the idea of the translations of the Torah into different languages. There's a Midrash that says when the Torah was translated into Greek, which is the famous story of the Septuagint during the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, about maybe over 250 years before the Common Era. So there's a Midrash that says, Yarad choshech la'olam, that darkness came to the world, meaning a terrible thing. The Torah was translated into Greek. But as you know, our Torah became a hit. It was translated into every possible language. And it happens to be, by the way, the history's bestseller of all books ever printed. Second place to Shakespeare, meaning Shakespeare is after it, not before it. So the Torah seems to be a big hit. On the other hand, it's not clear for those studying the Torah outside of Judaism whether they see it as a book which is to give direction in life or inspiration. I remember one time I was giving a talk. It was Shavuot in Bucharest, Romania, maybe about 8 to 9 years ago. And at the back of the synagogue was a young theological student. I think he was already a priest. And of course, our Shavuot comes out very close to the Orthodox Pentecost. And not Pentecost, excuse me. Pentecost, 50. And he said to me that he was interested in hearing things about the Bible. And because when he studied in theological school, they sort of like told him to keep away from the Old Testament. It might throw you off, etc. So on the one hand, there are certain people believe it's a holy book, but they don't encourage others to read it. And as we know, the oral tradition of Judaism seems to be very particular. If anything, in the competition, if you want to put it that way, in European history between Judaism and Christianity, the Talmud was always seen as the Jewish distortion of the ancient text of the Old Testament. The Talmud was burned for the first time in France in 1283, and then it was burned twice in Poland. I mean, so the Talmud was not considered by other religions holy writ, even though it's interesting that there are Talmudic stories in the Quran, because of course the Quran was very, took from here, took from there, and the stories sometimes are recorded as biblical stories and are actually Talmudic stories, like the story of King Solomon and Ashmedai, which is found in the Talmud in Gittin and is mentioned in the Quran. So what is the universal aspect in then for the Torah? Is the written Torah universal and the oral Torah particular? And if so, is the oral Torah particular because that's our explanation to the Torah, but the written Torah, everybody explains it the way they want? Of course, you might say that's already true. Of course, everybody's going to explain it the way they want. But then what is it about the Torah which makes it then particular or universal? The first Rashi on the Torah, on the word Breshit bara, Rashi asks a famous question, famous because it's the first Rashi on the Torah, so everybody knows the first one. It starts, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak said, which is already problematic. Who's Rabbi Yitzchak? Rashi doesn't tell us who Rabbi Yitzchak is, and he's not quoting a midrash. Some people think it's his father, because remember, Rashi is Shlomo ben Yitzchak. So it's very possible it's his father. It's not clear exactly who this Rabbi Yitzchak is. But Rabbi Yitzchak says, why did the Torah start with Breshit bara? It should have started with HaChodesh Hazeh, which is the book of Shemot, Exodus chapter 12. Why? Why not start with Breshit? Why does it have to start with Exodus 12? Because Shemot Yud Beit gives the first mitzvot, the first commandments, the first laws. Until then, there are no binding laws in the Torah. There are a few things mentioned, but not considered binding from a Jewish point of view. So why does this Torah start from Breshit bara? And then Rashi gives his famous answer, and which is, I guess, a very Zionist answer. God created the whole world, and therefore, and he decided that the land of Israel is for the Jewish people, and since he created everything, he can give it to them. Rashi was a big Zionist, even though he never heard the word, but he did know what Zion meant. So Nachmanides, Ramban, finds this very perplexing. Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, Nachmanides of the 13th century, always tries to interface with Rashi and either interpret him or ask questions about him. Ramban says, I missed that one, Rashi. I didn't get the question. Why did the Torah not start with Shemot Yud Beit, and why did it start with Breshit bara? So Ramban says, why not? Why can't it start with Breshit? Is all of the book of Breshit superfluous? All the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, and Rebecca, and Leah, that's all superfluous? We don't learn anything from it, and therefore you're saying we should skip? And if you're saying we should start from Shemot Yud Beit because it's halacha and laws, who says that the Torah is just a law book? I mean, that's an arbitrary decision. There's lots of things in the Torah that are not directly connected to halakha. The Torah has lots of stories that are to teach us Musar Haskel, to teach us ethical values. So why is it a problem that the Torah starts with Breshit bara? After asking a very good question on Rashi, Nachmanides Ramban supplies his own answer, because he always tries to justify Rashi in the end of the day. He says, I think Rashi's problem is not with the book of Breshit, but with the story of the creation of the universe, chapters 1 and 2. It's because, after all, we know from the Mishnah that the creation story is one of the two secrets of the Torah. The other one is Ezekiel chapter 1. So if the creation story is a secret, and if it's not to be understood according to its simple understanding, then why should the Torah even start with it? It should leave it out. It should be an esoteric teaching for the elite few, and that's it. Why is it so necessary to start with the Torah with Breshit Bara? But the point is then, for Nachmanides, the Torah is not just a legal book. It's not just a book with guidelines for mitzvot. It's to teach us things about life. And that's why we have all the stories there that we do. As the Midrash says on the chapter where Abraham sends his servant to look for a wife for Yitzchak in Chayei Sarah. So the Midrash says, Gadol sichatan shel avdei avot yoter mitoratan shel banim. Great is the idle talk of the servants of our patriarchs more than the Torah of the later generations. Because the Torah of the later generations is not in the Torah. But the idle talk of the servant of Abraham, where he's telling the story how he's looking for Rivka, is mentioned 3 times in that parsha. But that, of course, is to teach us that everybody's life in the end is a story. And if you can understand your life from a divine vantage point, which the prophets and great people were able to do, so then it really is Torah. We don't always see it from that vantage point, so we remain very often puzzled in what exactly the meaning is. I've always said that life is like walking into a movie where you didn't see the beginning, you're definitely not going to see the end, and you have to figure out exactly what it means. So it takes some time. And then after you figure out what it means, you have to figure out what your place is in that movie that you're watching. So it could be very confusing at times. So we have 2 perspectives then on the Torah. Rashi, which seems to imply that the Torah is a law book. And if it's a law book, well, I could say, okay, there are 7 Noahide laws that apply to the whole world. There's 613 for the Jews, more for the Jews, so maybe the Torah is just for the Jews. But if I look at the Torah like Nachmanides, that it's a book of teachings, then if it's a book of teachings about life, then it has something to teach everyone. You know, there's the Talmud says on the verse, Shema beni musar avicha va'al titosh torat imecha, which means, listen, my son, to the rebuking and the reproving of your father, and do not leave the Torah of your mother. So the Talmud says, of course from the Psalms, the Talmud says, the reproving of your father, that's the written Torah. The Torah of your mother, that's the oral tradition. Why is that? Because the written Torah will say an eye for an eye, and then the oral Torah will say, oh, it's talking about compensation. The written Torah will say, you didn't keep Shabbat, the death penalty. Whereas the oral tradition will say, well, it really depends whether there was a warning or not a warning, were there 2 witnesses, was it on purpose, was it not on purpose? It's like the father and the mother. The child does something wrong, father says, okay, I'm going to beat you on this one. The mother says, maybe not this time, let's discuss it. We don't really have to. Okay, that's like the interface between the written Torah and the oral tradition. The oral tradition, the written Torah says there's flogging 40 times. The oral tradition says not exactly 40 times. You have to see if the person can take it. You have to bring a doctor. Maybe they can't take 40 times, etc. Okay. So this is called the written Torah is called the father. The oral tradition is called the mother. As you know, in Judaism, the identity goes by the mother. So if we want to identify the Torah, the Jewish part of the Torah, it's the oral tradition, which is the mother. Why is the oral Torah the Jewish tradition? Because it's the way Jews look at the Torah. It's the spectacles through which we perceive the Torah. So really, the Jewish way of looking at the Torah is the oral tradition. In fact, this is to such an extent that if the oral tradition interprets the written tradition, it becomes the way Jews understand it, whether that goes along with the simple meaning of the text or not. To give you an example from today, it says in the Torah Usfartem lachem muchrat Shabbat, you're supposed to count from the day after the Sabbath, 50 days until the holiday of Shavuot. And of course, according to our tradition, the day after the Sabbath means the second day of Passover, because the first day of Passover is a Yom Tov, is prohibited in work, so it's like a Shabbat. Now, even if you were to prove to me that the day after the Sabbath is referring to Sunday and not the second day of Pesach necessarily, it wouldn't matter, it'd be irrelevant because that's our tradition. So the Jewish way of looking at the Torah is the Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, in a sense, we have three levels of the Torah. This can be found in a couple places. One place is actually an unusual discussion in the Jerusalem Talmud in Brachot, Yerushalmi. There used to be a time when a person, if they studied Torah, they would have to be pure, which means they had to go to the mikveh. Same thing, tefillah. It was called Takanat Ezra. It was an enactment by Ezra in the Second Temple period. You weren't supposed to pray, you weren't supposed to study Torah without being physically pure through a mikveh, through spring water. So the Talmud says, well, what happens if a person isn't? Is there something they can study anyhow? And there's a discussion. One person says, well, maybe they shouldn't study the actual text of the Torah, but they can study the oral tradition. And then somebody else says, no, maybe they can't study the oral tradition, maybe only the Agadah. And then somebody else says, maybe the Agadah not. So we have three levels of Torah: the written Torah, the oral tradition, and Agadah, which is some of the non-halachic explanations. The Vilna Gaon breaks it up in another three ways. He says there's the written Torah, the oral tradition, and the secrets of Torah, which he calls Kabbalah. Possibly secrets of Torah are found in the Agadah in the Second Temple period. So there becomes three levels of Torah. Again, the three levels of Torah are called the written text, the oral tradition, and the Agadah, which is called Mikra, the written text, Mishnah, the oral tradition, and Agadah or Sod, which is either the Agadic tradition or the secret tradition. I see this as three ways of looking at the Torah. The written text, which has a lot of stories of our matriarchs and patriarchs, etc., and the Jews came out of Egypt, these are stories to inspire us. Aside from the halachic principles, which are also, by the way, have their philosophical understanding, these are stories to inspire. The Mishnah, or the oral tradition, is to teach us how to live by the Torah, not just to be inspired by it. And the third part, which is called the Sod, or the secrets, and the Agadah, is how to connect to God. It's like there's a midrash which says, Ritzoncha shetedad mi shamar v'haya olam. If you want to know the one who said, let there be, and there was a world, then study the midrash. So what are these three levels? The written Torah is the level to inspire us. Prophetic writings are inspirational. In that sense, the written Torah is universal. It's not by chance that the written Torah was translated into every possible language. People understood it's an inspirational text. You can fight with it, you can agree with it, you can be inspired by it, but it's out there. And it's affected the whole world. I've always said the biggest proof of that is that every week has 7 days. Because there are 365 days in the year, because that's how long it takes for the earth to go around the sun. There are 30 days in a month, because it takes 29 and a half days for the moon to go around the earth. There are 24 hours in a day, because it takes 24 hours for the earth to rotate on its axis to get back to the same spot vis-a-vis the sun. There are 7 days in a week, because it says so in Genesis chapter 1. It's totally arbitrary. So the very fact that the whole world accepts the fact that there's 7 days in a week means somebody's been reading Genesis chapter 1. It's quite amazing when you think of it in that way. So definitely the written Torah has a universal aspect to it. In the early 20th century, in the late 19th century, already the Reform movement in the United States pointed out the universal aspects of the prophets, which they saw as a very important part of the Tanakh. In general, in traditional Judaism, we don't differentiate between parts of the Tanakh in that sense, but definitely there are universal messages to the whole Torah, and maybe specifically to a certain extent in the prophets as well. So then you might say that the scripture has a certain inspirational value which can be shared with all of mankind. Our oral tradition, which teaches us how to live, this is something which is incumbent upon Jews. If people find some of the stories inspirational, that's wonderful. But generally, the oral tradition is how to live by the Torah. That's something very particular to Jews. And definitely, and the third part, which is the secret of the Torah, is called the Agadah and the Sod, the Agadah and the secret parts of the Torah, which is to teach us how to connect to God. And this part is already something which is a challenge for every individual, that their relationship to God be something real and inspiring in their lives. Now, I want to read, there's not much time, so I will try to bring this to a conclusion very soon. The festival of Shavuot, which is coming up, is a festival which is not mentioned in the Torah as having a date, whereas all the other festivals do. Rosh Hashanah is the 1st of Tishrei, the Hebrew month of Tishrei, and Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei, and Sukkot is the 15th of Tishrei, and Passover is the Nisan. You might say that Shmini Atzeret doesn't officially have a date, but it's the day after Sukkot. If Sukkot is 7 days, it's called the 8th. Ubashmini Atzeret Yalachem, on the 8th day of, so it's pretty obvious. But Shavuot, we have to count 49 days, and the next day is Shavuot. No date is given. And actually, theoretically, the date could be different. Because even if you count from the second day of Passover, in the days where we decided the months according to testimony, depending on when the witnesses showed up at the temple, the previous Hebrew month could be either 29 or 30 days. So that theoretically, Shavuot could be on the 6th of Sivan or on the 5th, or on the 7th, depending on the month that came before, or even theoretically on the 7th. So the point is then that Shavuot is the only holiday which is dependent on our counting. It has to do with us. That's number one. Now, the Torah doesn't say that Shavuot is the giving of the Torah. That's a tradition that we have in the Talmud. It's called the Festival of the Harvest and the Festival of the Bikurim, of the first fruit, from Shavuot till Sukkot to bring the first fruit. So Shavuot is something you have to reach through human initiative. You have to count. And with the Talmudic implication or tradition that it's the giving of the Torah, it starts to come together. The reason why we have to use initiative, because the Torah doesn't exactly fall into your hands. You have to jump. You have to make the effort. It might be your inheritance, but you have to show interest in order to understand it. Another thing is that the very fact that the Torah itself does not mention that Shavuot is the giving of the Torah means it's a secret. What is the secret? You know, we have a tradition to read the book of Ruth on Shavuot. Why do we read the book of Ruth? Well, first of all, the book of Ruth takes place in Ksir Chitim, Ksir Sorim, during the harvest, and Shavuot always happens during the time of the harvest. That's why it's called the holiday of the harvest. Also, there's another reason, because the Megillah Ruth is full of acts of kindness that Ruth does to her mother-in-law, and Boaz to Ruth, and etc. And the Torah is called in Mishle and Proverbs, Torah Chesed, the Torah of kindness. So there are different reasons, but there's one particular reason which I find interesting. And that is Boaz, when he says he's interested in marrying Ruth, because in those days they understood the yibum, the levirate marriage, not only is from a brother to the widow of the brother, but actually a relative to a relative. So Boaz says, I could do it, but there's somebody who is a closer relative than myself. I have to ask them. Now, Ruth was a Moabite woman, and the Torah says that a Moabite cannot enter the Jewish people, even the 10th generation. But the Talmud says a Moabite man cannot, because it says Moavi, but a Moabite woman can, because Moavi is in the male form. So that means if she's a Moaviah, if she's a female, it's okay. Which also might make some sense in the story itself, because it says because they wanted to fight you and they weren't willing to give you bread and water, which was referring, of course, to the men. But that's the oral tradition that says the Moabite women can, the Moabite men cannot. And the Ploni Almoni, that relative who was closer than Boaz, didn't want to marry Ruth because he was afraid of the stigmas, what people would say if he married a Moabite woman. And Boaz had no problem because of his belief in the oral tradition. So the book of Ruth is also strengthening our belief in the oral tradition, which is that particular way in which we live our lives according to the Torah. But the fact that it's a secret that the Torah was given on Shavuot also relates to the fact that the Torah is not only the Mikra, the scripture, which is the inspirational, the oral tradition of how to live it, but also the Sod, the secret part of the Torah. And how do I know it's the secret part of the Torah? Because we call Shavuot the holiday of the giving of the Torah. But the Torah was not given on Shavuot. What happened on Shavuot, according to our tradition in the Talmud on Shabbat, is that God spoke to the Jewish people the Decalogue, what we call the 10 Commandments. Nothing was given. But the very act of this revelation and interface between God and the Jewish people, that is Torah. Because what I referred to beforehand as the secret, that's actually the point of the Torah. The point of the Torah is to have a meeting, to have an interface between God and Israel. When that happens, that's called the giving of the Torah. And even if the 10 Commandments themselves were inscribed 40 days later, and even if the Torah itself was written during the course of those 40 years in the desert, that first meeting between God and Israel, that is the giving of the Torah. And that's the goal of the giving of the Torah. It says at Sinai, Kol Gadol V'lo Yasaf, which means a great voice which never stopped, because that voice is constantly speaking to us through the Torah, and every generation has to renew its connection with the Torah. So if I get back to my first question, is the Torah universal? Well, the scripture is universal in the sense that it's inspirational. The oral tradition was always seen as something particular to the Jews because, in a sense, yes, it's the way we live our lives. It's how to live by the Torah. Not everybody in the world is interested in that. It's the Jewish people and those who join us. I guess in another sense, though, what we call the secrets of Torah, which is that interface between God and the Jewish people, also has an inspirational side to teach people to live not only as ethical people, but ethical people in the face of God. I wish everybody Chag Sameach.